Paul Bertau Cornely, born 1906, died 2002. West Indian physician. In 1934, Paul Bertau Cornely became the first African American to earn a PhD in public health, and in 1969, the American Public Health Association elected him its first black president. During the 1940s and 1950s, he studied the treatment black patients received at hospitals in the southern and northern United States. To the surprise of many who assumed the conditions would be better in the North, Cornely's research found that African Americans received substandard medical treatment on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. During the 1950s, Cornely, along with two other leaders in the medical and civil rights community, spearheaded an effort to integrate healthcare facilities in the United States. Their work would culminate in the 1964 Supreme Court case, Simpkins versus Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital, which integrated healthcare, as the more famous Brown versus the Board of Education integrated schooling. Cornely taught at Howard University for some 40 years and directed the Freeman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. for more than a decade. Paul Bertau Cornely was born in Pointe-à-Pitre, Guadeloupe, in the French West Indies, on March 9, 1906. The son of Eleodore and Adrienne Malon Cornely, he was raised and educated in Puerto Rico, and in 1920 migrated to the mainland United States. In 1924, he began his studies at the College of the City of Detroit, but soon afterward switched to the University of Michigan. After earning his B.A. at Michigan in 1928, Cornely continued his studies there, and in 1931 received his M.D. degree. 3 years later, in 1934, Cornely earned his Ph.D. degree as well, making him one of those rare individuals who possess a double doctorate. Of greater historical significance was the fact that his degree made him the first African American to earn a Ph.D. in anatomy. Cornely's area of specialty was public health, and his dissertation, which was later published, carried the title A Survey of Postgraduate Medical Education in the United States and an Inquiry into the Educational Needs of the General Practitioner. In 1934, Cornely became an assistant professor in the Medical College of Howard University, where he would remain until his retirement nearly 40 years later. He moved up to the position of associate professor in 1935 and worked as director of health service from 1937 to 1947. In 1937, Cornely experienced another milestone when he became a United States citizen. He served as head of the university's Department of Bacteriology, Preventive Medicine, and Public Health in 1943, and held that position until 1947. Cornely became a full professor in 1947 and would continue to teach at Howard for another quarter century until 1973. In the meantime, he stayed active in his profession. From 1947 to 1958, he was medical director of Freeman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which at one time had been the only healthcare facility in the area that would treat black patients. In 1955, he became director of Howard's Department of Community Health Service, a position he held until 1970. In addition to his job at Howard, Cornely was consulting for the National Urban League, conducting studies of the healthcare services available to blacks in the southern and northern United States. Facilities in the South, Cornely discovered by observing two cities, were abominable, but services in the North, as the studies of 3 cities showed, were not much better. On both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, there was a much lower ratio of hospital beds for black patients, and even the provision of beds served as no guarantee that patients would be admitted. One of the many unfortunate cases Cornely observed involved the death of a black college administrator and National Young Women's Christian Association executive who had the misfortune to get into a car crash near Dalton, Georgia. Because Dalton's hospital had a no Negroes policy, an ambulance had to be called from 66 miles away, and the woman died before she could receive proper treatment. In another instance, a white man was forced out of Atlanta's Grady Hospital uh, forced out of Atlanta's Grady Hospital in the middle of a pouring rain because someone saw his son-in-law, who happened to be a black man, and said, "What? Have we put a nigger in the white ward?" The son-in-law was Walter White, executive director of the NAACP. Between World War II and the passage of Medicare in the 1960s, the largest federal grant program for public health was the Hospital Survey and the Construction Act of 1946, known as Hill-Burton for the two senators who wrote it. The act provided for so-called separate but equal medical facilities for black patients, which tended to be all too separate but not particularly equal. Cornely, along with Lewis Tompkins Wright, a Harlem surgeon and chairman of the NAACP Board of Directors, and Howard University anatomist William Montague Cobb, set out to challenge segregation in hospitals. In the 1950s, Cornely, Wright, and Cobb brought together forces from the NAACP, National Medical Association, National Urban League, and the American Public Health Association to deal with what they called perhaps the greatest of all discriminatory evils, differential treatment with respect to hospital facilities. The NAACP, its leadership inspired by the efforts of the three from 1957 to 1963, sponsored the Imhotep Conference, at which doctors, leaders of professional organizations, and members of the media came together to discuss the issue of racial integration in hospitals. These discussions would ultimately yield tangible results when a black dentist from North Carolina, George Simpkins, brought a legal challenge to the separate but equal policies of a medical facility that received Hill-Burton funds. Helped by NAACP legal counsel, Simpkins took his case to the Supreme Court, whose March 2, 1964 decision in Simpkins versus Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital forced the integration of hospitals. Simpkins was to health care what Brown versus the Board of Education had been to schooling 10 years before, and though Cornely did not take part in the actual case, his efforts had been instrumental in paving the way for it. During the 1950s, Cornely served as chief negotiator for the United States in helping to establish educational facilities for two newly independent or soon-to-be independent African countries. As Africa saw the end of European colonialism, it was a time of great optimism, and many Americans believed that conditions for Africans could be greatly improved by the infusion of Western aid. Cornely helped set up a nursing school in Sierra Leone near the far western tip of Africa, and a medical school in Ghana on the southern coast of the African hump that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. As was typical of subsequent African history, Sierra Leone succumbed to a series of coups and dictatorships, but the later history of Ghana offered more hope. An ancient civilization whose charismatic leader Kwame Nkrumah was a figure of world renown during the time Cornely worked with the Ghanaians, Ghana would devolve into poverty and unrest partly through Nkrumah's mismanagement, but would undergo a recovery in the 1980s under the leadership of Jerry Rawlings. As a consultant to the U.S. Agency for International Development, Cornely was heavily involved in the affairs of emerging African nations for a period of time. In 1969, Cornely became the first black president of the American Public Health Association, and in 1972 he received that body's Sedgwick Memorial Medal. From 1970 to 1972, he served on the President Richard M. Nixon's Committee on Population Growth and the American Future. The University of Michigan gave him an honorary degree in 1968, as did the University of the Pacific in 1973. In the latter year, Cornely retired from Howard to become an emeritus professor, and in 1992 the university awarded him an honorary degree. After his retirement, he served as a staff member of Health Services Evaluation Systems, Inc. from 1973 to 1981. Throughout his years in academia, Cornely continued to write extensively, contributing to journals and popular magazines. and publishing some 100 articles. An example of his work was, quote, "The Health Status of the Negro Today and in the Future," unquote, for the American Journal of Public Health, April 1968, in which he discussed the major healthcare problems facing Black Americans. As Cornely wrote, the situation was urgent and needed to be addressed soon. At the conclusion of the article, he offered possible solutions. Cornely has also published several books on public health and medical education. Cornely married May Stewart of Macon, Georgia, in 1934, and they had one child, Paul B. Cornely Jr. The Cornelys lived in Silver Springs, Maryland, and in religion are Catholics. Among Cornely's many professional and civic memberships are, or have been, the American Public Health Association, of which, as noted above, he served as president from 1969 to 1970, the American College of Preventive Medicine Fellow, the American College of Healthcare Executives Honorary Fellow, and the Community Group Health Foundation, president from 1968 to 1974. Citations are in the description.